that are going on. And of course, our president, it looks like, is going to be dominating the front page news for a while. A lot of things that are otherwise going on are not going to be there. There was a particular article that appeared. I picked it up from a foreign news service, but chances are, if it appears over here at all, it'll appear in some little remote section way back in the back pages of the paper. But this particular article announced a meeting between President Boris Yeltsin of Russia and French President Jacques Chirac and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl coming up on the 25th and 26th of March. Now, this dates back to October, when there was a meeting of the Council of Europe, and right toward the end of that several-day period of meetings, there was an announcement made that an agreement had been signed between France, Germany, and Russia, entering into a special tripartite agreement, and a treaty between the three of them. And one of the aspects of it is going to be the regular summit meetings that are going to occur. One of the things that was sort of interesting about this, the original source that I picked up on it was from a British news service, and they were chiding the Prime Minister of Britain because he'd been over there at the Council meeting, the Council of Europe meeting, and showed up back in London, found out about this new alliance after he got back to London and listened to it on the news. And they said, well, does this mean that Britain has been snubbed? And, oh, no, of course not. Just the fact they didn't tell us doesn't mean anything. The point was, of course, they were, because France, Germany, and Russia had gotten together and left everybody else out and said, the three of us are going to get together and determine the future of Europe. And Boris Yeltsin's comment here is an interesting statement. He said that this new setup with this tripartite agreement is necessary because of the creation of a grand Europe, including Russia. That's an interesting statement, and I'm going to come back to it. But at this point, I want to ask the question: as we look at items in the news, how can we assess the prophetic significance of current news events, of things that are happening on the world scene? How is it that we can assess and say what is important, what is going to play a significant role in the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and what is not? Well, there are a number of keys to the understanding of Bible prophecy, and I want to focus in here this afternoon on one particular key. One key that sometimes is commented upon, but very rarely has been gone into in much detail. And I think it can be helpful to us as we begin to understand a little more about this particular key. And to start with, let's set the stage for it by going back to 1 Corinthians 10. Because the particular key to which I want to call our attention here this afternoon relates to understanding the way the Bible uses duality. There is duality that runs through the Bible, a type and antitype. There is a duality that we will see. And I want to focus in on three areas of prophecy: prophecy regarding the church, prophecy regarding modern Israel, and prophecy relating to the beast power. And notice some things here in terms of duality and some of the things that we can learn. It's important to understand some of these things in the context that is brought out in the Scriptures. Various ones, over the years, people can always look in. You know the old statement, well, you can prove anything by the Bible. Well, you can't prove anything by the Bible if you take the Bible in its context. But if you just grab out a few words here or a verse here, you can seemingly prove virtually anything, but that's not really proving it. We have to understand the Bible in its context, and we have to do that in order to begin to understand the duality that is there, the prophetic aspect. Now, let's pick it up in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Here the Apostle Paul is writing, and he says in 1 Corinthians 10:1, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant, how that our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea." That's the only example I know of anybody that got baptized and didn't get wet. Now, they were immersed in water. Hey, they were right down at the bottom of the Red Sea. It was on either side, and the cloud covered them, so they were totally surrounded by water. They were immersed in water, but they didn't get wet. So anyway, Paul says, well, he draws that analogy about baptism, and showing here the connection. He said they did all eat the same spiritual meat. They all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. With many of them, God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, notice here verse 6. Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be you idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur you, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for examples, or for types, as the margin renders it, for types, for examples. They are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. Now when you go back to the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you cover a 40-year period in the history of the nation of Israel. 4 books zero in on that 40-year period. Actually, as you go through the books, those particular books, you'll find most of the content is focused in on about 3 of those 40 years. Now, the Bible covers in just a matter of a few chapters. Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5. It covers, over 1,600 years, the whole history of the pre-flood world summed up in just a few chapters. And yet, here are entire books that are devoted to a very short period. When God slows down and gives a close focus, there are obviously things He wants us to learn. As you look through the Scriptures, you find that there are certain periods when it's like the focus zeroes in for a close-up. And you've got a close-up shot, and you've got details that are all brought out. And in other cases, you have a summary given in 2 or 3 verses that summarize great, broad periods of time. So God slows down here on this period of Israel, the establishment of the Old Testament church, the church in the wilderness, as it's called, the congregation of Israel. Paul explains here that the things that happened to them were examples. They were type. It represented a model, a pattern. And we find right here that it was written down specifically, the incidents that were recorded. A lot happened in 40 years. We have certain incidents that are recorded that are preserved for us. Those things that were recorded were written down for our admonition. They are things from which all of God's people can learn, and particularly God's people in the end time. They're written down for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. So we find here a duality, that there is a matter of history that is not simply recorded as ancient history. It's not a matter that God's just writing an academic textbook. Well, this thing happened to these folks who lived way back a long time ago. That's right, it was history. But it was also prophetic. It was recorded. It provides examples and illustrations. There is much that we can learn. We learn, for instance, the things Israel encountered in the wilderness are typical of the kinds of things that the people of God will encounter and have encountered down through the centuries. The same kinds of problems. And what we learn here is that, as it brings out, that those who came out of Egypt didn't all enter into the promised land, did they? With many of them who came out, God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, we learn something here. That's written down for our admonition as an example for us. We find that just because people start out doesn't automatically guarantee they finish up. There are problems that are encountered along the way, and what Israel went through is a model for us. Now, let me show you back in Deuteronomy 8. This is a key couple of verses here, because it explains to us why they spent the 40 years in the wilderness. Why don't we just go from being baptized to being in the kingdom? Just, let's skip having to grow and overcome. Let's just go from being baptized to being changed, spirit being. Leave out all these years in between. Well, it doesn't work that way. Israel didn't go from being in Egypt to being in the promised land. Just zip, zip. Notice here in Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, God says, "And you shall remember all the way which the eternal your God led you, these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not." Why did God lead them the 40 years in the wilderness? 2 reasons: to humble them and to prove them. He humbled them, as he explains, by putting them in a situation where they were confronted with their total inability to sustain themselves. You know, you get folks out in the middle of the Sinai Desert, and there's not a whole lot they can do to provide food, clothing, and shelter for themselves. It doesn't take you long to run out of water in your canteen. God let them run out a few times. And, you know, we read those accounts, and we say, you know, we read of how those people griped and complained, and they were ready to stone Moses, and we think, man, if I'd have been back there, I wouldn't have been carnal like those folks. It'd have been me and Moses and Joshua, you know, the three of us. We'd have been standing there. We look at that and we're just amazed. You know, man, these people, they came out, they saw all this stuff, and here they are. Look how carnal they are. Why they're fussing and complaining and griping. And you read the story carefully, and you read, they'd run out of water. Now, I want to tell you, you know, in the years I've been in church, I have heard folks fuss and gripe about a whole lot less than being in the middle of the desert with an empty canteen. You know, they're examples. God says this is written down for our admonition. It's to teach us lessons, and it's to remind us, you see, as we look at what they went through. God allows us all to get in situations. He wants to humble us and to prove us. That's what God's after. That's what our years in the wilderness are. He humbled them by putting them in a situation where they couldn't sustain themselves. They were stripped of all illusions of self-sufficiency. You know, when we're able to, you know, go and do and all this stuff, it's easy for us to think, well, you know, I'm pretty self-sufficient. I got my garden over here, and I got my well, and I got this, and I got that. Self-sufficient? What if the rain doesn't come? You know, what if the hailstorm comes? What if this happens? What if that happens? We're not self-sufficient. We are totally dependent upon God for every breath of air we breathe, for the water, for everything. Here they were out in the middle of the blazing desert. There was nothing they could do. Well, God took care of them. He provided them water out of the rock. He sent manna to feed them. Their clothes and shoes didn't wear out. He provided a cloud to shade them by night or by day. You see, they were put in a situation where they were confronted with their absolute helplessness. And in the course of our life, God lets us get in situations where we have to confront our helplessness. Sometimes it can involve a whole range of things. It can involve everything from health problems to economic problems to this kind of problem, that kind of problem. We all run into things that you and I can't fix in our own lives. God allows us to get in situations to humble us, to bring us to the recognition of how totally dependent we are upon God. Because we are, even when we think we're taking care of it ourselves, we're still dependent on Him. We just may not be aware of it because we're looking at outward things. But He humbles us. But He also proves us to see what's in our heart. Now, Paul said there's a predictive aspect. There is a duality. These things were types and examples. You think maybe some of the things that we have gone through in recent years have been to prove us, to find out what was in our heart? Don't you think we have, there have been a lot of things made manifest that you and I wouldn't have been able to figure out. And as far as what was really in the heart, because we look and we see what people are doing outwardly. But God brings His people through the wilderness, and this is down through time. And particularly, Paul says, it's for our admonition upon whom the ends of the age are come. So we find that these things that Israel of old, particularly that period in the wilderness, those things that happened to them, there was a duality. They went through literal event, but those events foreshadowed what the people of God would encounter on through the future. Let's notice an example of how this is brought out back in 2 Peter chapter 2. We'll notice how Peter here uses the history of God's people as predictive of what the future was to bring. Peter is writing here in the late 60s A.D., probably about 68 A.D., shortly before his own death. And there's a lot that has happened and is happening in the New Testament church at this time. Things started out with a great bang. There were tremendous miracles on the day of Pentecost. There was explosive growth. There was all these exciting things. And then life set in. Year after year went by. And, now, since the day of Pentecost, we're talking 68 A.D., we're talking over 35 years that's gone by. And, of course, people have gotten older and some have died, and now a number of the apostles have been killed. Within a couple of years, Jerusalem will be destroyed, the temple will be burned. Things are happening. Problems in the church. Simon the sorcerer has been engaged in some of his activities. Now notice what Peter told them, 2 Peter 2, verse 1. He says, "But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privately shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of." Now, Peter goes on, but where does he start? He says, you look back at the Old Testament. There were false prophets that arose among the people of God in centuries past, and he said, don't be shocked, there are going to be false teachers show up among you. Because you see, there is a duality. So Peter looks back at what the people of God have experienced in the past, and he tells the brethren of his day, and it's recorded for us, that there are things you can expect. There will be false teachers who privately shall bring in damnable heresy. Now, sometimes some people were shocked. So, well, I don't see how this can be. Well, how can it be? Well, 2 Peter 2:1 tells us it was not something that should be totally unexpected. There is a duality that runs through. Notice what Jude says in the book of Jude. We pick it up just a few pages over. Verse 4, he says, "There are certain men crept in unawares, who were before of old ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of our God into lawlessness, denying the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. I will therefore put you in remembrance, though you once knew this, how that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed them that believed not." Now, Jude brings out, he says, I'm going to remind you of something you've known in the past. Everybody that came out of Egypt didn't make it into the promised land, he said. There were those that God dealt with in the wilderness, and they never entered the promised land. So Jude is here, again, telling people, look back, learn. There is a predictive element. There is a duality that runs through. And so Jude explains this, and he shows how we learn various things. There were angels who didn't keep their first estate. They rebelled. Sodom and Gomorrah, verse 7. "And the cities about them gave themselves over to immorality, went after strange flesh. They are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." There are consequences to certain actions. There is, as one person said, and I think this sort of summed it up, her comment was that if God's judgment doesn't come on modern America, He certainly owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because when you look at what's going on and what we've had, isn't it incredible? Latest scandals and the president's popularity is higher than ever. One of the editorials I read in the newspaper a couple of days ago referred to this new whole set of scandals. They came up with a catchy title for it. They referred to it as Zippergate. It's incredible. I mean, here you can have this sort of thing, and people aren't shocked. They're not. That doesn't bother them. It shows. It says something about the state of morality in our nation. Not just that something like this happened, but the fact that to most people it's really no big deal. It's really no big deal, and I think it says something about our expectations as a nation and about what is there. But Jude explains that there is a pattern. God did certain things in the past, and it sets forth an example. It illustrates how God is ultimately going to deal with those things. There is a duality that comes through. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to Daniel 11. We'll notice one other section here relating to this. Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 opens here in the right after Babylon had fallen to the Medes and Persians. Babylon fell actually on the evening of the Feast of Trumpets in 539 BC, and the Persians took over. Cyrus, who was the emperor over the empire of the Medes and the Persians, actually placed his uncle, Darius the Mede. Cyrus was a Mede on his mother's side. His mother was a Median princess, and his father was a Persian prince. And so he united the Medes and the Persians, and his uncle Darius, who was a Median prince, a much older man, was actually left in Babylon over the kingdom of Babylon and was there for 2 or 3 years because Cyrus went on with his army and defeated the main Babylonian army, which was elsewhere, and eventually came back and made Babylon the capital of his whole empire. But Darius the Mede is mentioned here. This was right after the fall of Babylon. And Daniel had a vision in this. He was told, and it was revealed to him here, that in verse 2, that there would stand up yet several other kings in Persia, and then there would arise a great mighty king from Greece, who would rule with a great dominion, and then he would be broken off, and his empire would be divided among the 4 winds, or toward the 4 winds, not according to his posterity. And what we find, of course, historically, that's what happened. The Persian Empire went on for about 200 years, and the Greeks, led by Alexander the Great, who put together this great empire, came across, conquered the Persian Empire, and then about 10 years later he died, and the empire split. It remained a Greek in language, culture, and religion, but it split. His generals all were scurrying to try to get their part of it, and divided up 4 directions, 2 of which are significant from the biblical perspective, because 2 of these kingdoms of Alexander bordered Judah and Jerusalem. The other 2 were elsewhere and did not directly border Judah and Jerusalem and didn't really interact with what was going on in Jerusalem. But one of these kingdoms, one of his generals, Antiochus, Seleucus, had set up a kingdom north that would take in what is now much of modern day Syria and Iraq. And he was north. It was a Greek kingdom. He was Greek, a Greek general, and he ruled over this area that gradually began to diminish under his successors, but he had a kingdom north of Jerusalem. The Ptolemy, another of Alexander's generals, set up a kingdom based in Egypt, and his empire extended down that direction, Egypt, and on into portions of Arabia. And so, from the standpoint of Jerusalem, one was north of Jerusalem, the other was south of Jerusalem. As we go on through Daniel 11, we get into a very detailed account of the interaction between the Seleucid kings of the north and the Ptolemaic kingdom kings of the south, and the fighting and everything back and forth. And it's an interesting story just to go through. It is the most detailed prophecy in the Bible of going through almost decade by decade of this interaction back and forth. Well, we're not going to have time to go into all of that here this afternoon, but let's come on down toward the end of the chapter. We'll pick up the story down here in verse 30, verses 29 and 30. We've come on down through the story until there has come on the scene in Syria a man by the name of Antiochus, called Antiochus Epiphanes. And he had become the king up in the north, and he had invaded and come down to attack Egypt. He wanted to absorb the whole thing. And we find in verse 29, we pick up the story, at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him. And he'll be grieved and return and have indignation against the Holy Covenant. Now what happened, the ships of Kittim was the ancient name of Sicily and southern Italy. The second time when Antiochus came down, he was going to absorb Egypt. When he got there, the Roman fleet, this was about 170 BC, the Roman fleet had showed up. They didn't want to see him expand his empire, and they showed up and were going to ally themselves with the Egyptians. And so he came out on the short end. He decided that he didn't want to fight them. So he went back through. Well, he had to go back up through Jerusalem to get home, so he was mad, and he decided, he'd just kill a few Jews. He'd hadn't had good luck with the Egyptians, so he would, sort of like the bully. He goes to pick on somebody, and all of a sudden, somebody bigger shows up, and he decides he doesn't want to do that. So he looks around, and he finds somebody that he thinks he can really show how tough he is. So that's sort of what Antiochus did. He came back, and he entered into an agreement here with apostate Jews. There were Jews who were attracted to this Greek culture. When Alexander's empire broke up, or among his generals, it remained a Greek empire. They were united by Greek language, Greek culture, Greek religion. The only thing they were divided by is who was going to run it. See, that was what the generals couldn't agree on. So it was a Greek empire, And there was this squabbling going on. And many of the people, that's why the Greek language came to spread throughout the Middle East so much. It really set the stage for the New Testament church in a lot of ways, some of those ways. But it attracted people who wanted to blend in. They were prepared to give up their identity, and they wanted to become just like the society around them. Now, I want to read you a few brief comments from a historical book that was written about 150 years before the birth of Christ. It was never considered by the Jews as a part of Scripture. It's not was never intended as a part of Scripture, but it is a historical account from that time, the book of 1 Maccabees. And they say, Alexander reigned 12 years, and he died, and his servants bore rule, every one in his place. And there came out of one of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been hostage at Rome. And he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. That was 175 B.C. In those days, there went out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, let's go and make a covenant with the nations round about us. Since we departed from them, we've had much sorrow. And so this device pleased them well. They built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the customs of the heathen. They made themselves uncircumcised, forsook the holy covenant, joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. And it talks about what Antiochus did, and he entered into Egypt, and then after he had done this, and he returned again and went up against Israel in Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary and took away the golden altar and the candlestick and all the vessels. And when he had taken this away, he went to his own land, having made a great massacre and spoken very proudly. So here we read the historic fulfillment of what Daniel is talking about, how that Antiochus had intelligence or entered into collusion with those that forsook the holy covenant, with apostate Jews. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. And they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Now we find, as we come on down through the historical account in Maccabees, that the King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people. Everyone should leave his laws, so all the heathen agree according to the commandment of the king. Many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And so we come on down, and we're told that the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should follow the strange laws of the land and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, that they should profane the Sabbaths and the festival days. And a little later on, he set up an abomination of desolation upon the altar, built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But this is exactly what Daniel had prophesied of. This was the historical fulfillment. There arose, in the aftermath of this, what was called the Maccabee Revolt, initiated by an elderly priest by the name of Matthias. And a period of about 3 years went by, and in the aftermath of that period, the Greeks were defeated, were expelled from Jerusalem, and the temple was cleansed. And a new altar was dedicated. Now, as we go right here, just through this section of Daniel 11, where we read about what Antiochus was doing, and he took away the sacrifice, placed the abomination, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. This contrast between those who entered into collusion with Antiochus and were going to be part of this one world movement that the Greeks were establishing. That was Alexander's attempt. See, it dates from the Tower of Babel and Nimrod. Alexander wanted his soldiers that he brought out of Greece. He wanted them to intermarry with all the peoples there. He stretched his empire all the way to India. He wanted them to intermarry. He wanted one language, one culture, one religion. He wanted to create one world. And of course, he was going to be at the pinnacle of it. That wasn't a real original idea with him. You find Nimrod had the same idea. God put a stop to that. And Alexander wasn't the last fellow to have that idea. There have been a number of those folks that have had those ideas, and you know what? There's, a little bit of that yet ahead of us, isn't it? Well, That's where we get into the duality of it. We see the description, the details of what Antiochus did. We see this dichotomy here among the people of God. Some entered into collusion. They thought, okay, they're going to be a part of this. Others, those that knew their God, were strong and did exploits. Verse 33, they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by spoil many days. When they shall fall, they'll be helped with a little help. Many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Some of them of understanding shall fall to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it's yet for a time appointed. All of a sudden now, here we have skimmed over about 2,000 years of history, and we're down to the time of the end. And the chapter comes on down and focuses in on the end time fulfillment. Now what we find here is that there is a duality. We find that there are recurring patterns that show themselves in the story of God's people. We find that that's summarized, you see, that there are those who will do wickedly, and there are those who will know their God and be strong. And that those that understand will instruct, and yet there will be trials and tests. There will be those who are persecuted, who fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity. We'll find that even some of those of understanding fall. They go through persecution to try them, to purge them, to make them white, even to the time of the end. All the way down. 2,000 years of the history of the people of God is summarized in these 2 or 3 verses. There are recurring patterns that you can count on. You can count on Satan's attempts to subvert, to entice people into forsaking their identity and to simply going into the world. When you go back to the story of Israel in the wilderness, all the way from the incident of the golden calf, all the way through, you go through the Judges, you go through the Kings and Chronicles, you see all these things, and you keep seeing this recurring pattern. Come down to the New Testament, come all the way down through church history, come down to our day. There is a recurring pattern. There is a duality, you see. There are recurring patterns that show themselves in the story of the people of God. And so we're warned. And we are given insight that there is that duality. There are those recurring patterns. We are shown by historical example the responses with which God is pleased and the responses with which He's not pleased. So that we are equipped for encountering whatever trials and tests that come our way. You and I don't know specifically every specific thing we may be called upon to go through. But what we can guarantee is that there is a proper response, there's a godly response, and there is a bad response. And so we have these examples. Now let's take the example of modern Israel. Let's take some prophecies regarding Israel itself. Let's set the stage by going back to 2 Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles chapters 34 and 35, we have the story of King Josiah. Now Josiah came to the throne at 8 years of age. He succeeded his father Ammon and his grandfather Manasseh. Manasseh was the most wicked king that Judah ever had. He was just absolutely corrupt and did everything he could do. Tried to absolutely destroy the Bible. Thought he had. I'll show that to you here in just a moment. Josiah came to the throne at the age of 8. When he was 16, he really began to seriously seek God. And at age 20, when he took over full rulership of the kingdom, he began a series of reforms to try to get things back on the track. Well, in his 18th year, when he was about 25, 26, he decided that they were going to take up a collection, take up money, and repair the temple. The temple had been shut down as a result of what Manasseh had done. It had fallen into great disrepair. And so, as we come on down through the story, we find in verse 14, they brought out the money that was brought into the house of the Lord, and Hilkiah the priest found a book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. And Hilkiah answered, and he said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah delivered the book to Shaphan. And Shaphan carried the book to the king. They had rediscovered the Bible. Some faithful priest had hidden the official temple copy of the Scriptures when Manasseh was trying to destroy things, had hidden it. And for years, they had not had a complete copy of the Scriptures. Now, in the course of repairing and removing stones and replacing, they came on the hiding place. They discovered the book of the law. Now, the book of the law is brought before Josiah, and it's read to him. And when he hears it, we're told that he rent his clothes, verse 19. See, he knew they were in trouble. He knew they were off the track, but he didn't know how much trouble they were in. When they read to him the curses out of Deuteronomy, he realized it was serious business. All the things they had been doing were prophesied there in Deuteronomy, and a curse was pronounced, a curse of captivity. And the king said, oh no, we are in very serious trouble. So they sent word to inquire of one of God's servants, of the prophet, God's message. What was going to happen? And the message came back to them, as recorded down in verse 25, because they've forsaken me and have burned incense unto other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath shall be poured out on this place, and it shall not be quenched. But as for the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire, you tell him, verse 27, that because his heart was young and tender, he humbled himself before me, and when he heard these things, because of his attitude, I won't do it in his lifetime. I'm going to bring about all these curses. They're going to happen. But I won't do it in Josiah's lifetime, because he is a man that has really turned his heart to me, and so I'm not going to do it during his lifetime. But when he's dead, it's over with. Well, you better believe everybody said, long live the king. They were, everybody was hoping he'd live to be a long, old man, And he didn't live to be that old. He lived for a while, but chapter 35 tells the story. Josiah died. And verse 24 tells us they brought him in a chariot back to Jerusalem. He died and was buried in the sepulchres of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah, verse 25, and Jeremiah lamented for Josiah. And all the singing men and the singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentation to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are written in the Lamentations. Now, here we read that Jeremiah, who was God's prophet during that time, lamented for Josiah. The Lamentations were written down. It was written in the Lamentations and made an ordinance in Israel and made a part of the Bible. Well, you can turn back to the very end of the book of Jeremiah. A lot of the critics, you read the commentaries, they scratch their heads and they're trying to figure out what happened to this. Well, if you turn to the end of the book of Jeremiah, no, what's the book that comes next, right after Jeremiah? Little short book entitled The Lamentations of Jeremiah. Well, now, if Jeremiah lamented and wrote it in the Lamentations, and it was made an ordinance in Israel, written down, where do you find the Lamentations? Well, right here. Little short book. Now, what you find in the book of Lamentations is a prophetic lament about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the people. Jeremiah looked forward beyond Josiah's death, and he recognized what the consequences were going to be. And so he wrote this down, this lament, that focused in specifically on what was going to happen in a few years. Within 15 years after Josiah's death, Nebuchadnezzar had invaded Judah with the armies of Babylon, had come in and made Judah an occupied territory, a captured province. He took some of the young Jews, Daniel and his friends, for instance, took them into captivity, took them to Babylon. He placed a man on the throne that he wanted on the throne, and time went on. A few years later, about 596, he comes back, about 12 years later. He comes back and doesn't like, actually it's not 12 years later, it's 8 years later, comes back and is not happy with the way things are running, so he takes some more folks into captivity and puts his man on the throne and charges him a little extra money, goes back, and then pretty soon he's hearing bad reports. He's got trouble down in Judah. So then he comes back the final time, third time, burns the city, burns the temple, either kills the people or hauls them off into captivity. And Jerusalem is destroyed. The book of Lamentations looks forward and anticipates prophetically that final destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Now, years went by, and after the Persians took over, Cyrus, king of Persia, issued a decree that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, and they came back under Zerubbabel. The temple stood for another 600 years, and then the Romans came in 70 A.D., and they destroyed Jerusalem. They burned the temple. They butchered people. So, the book of Lamentations, interestingly, the date that the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the 9th and 10th days of the 5th month, the month Ab, in the Jewish calendar. Almost 600 years later, on that exact time, the 9th of Ab, the Roman armies under Titus burned Jerusalem and the temple. The temple was destroyed twice on the same date. Well, the Jews read the book of Lamentations on that day every year, the Orthodox Jews. They understand what it was talking about. It was a lament for the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. It occurred twice. It occurred by Babylon, it occurred by Rome. But, as we're going to see, Christ showed that what was going to happen in the first century to Jerusalem was a type of what was going to be experienced by all Israel in a future time, that time called the Great Tribulation. So, let's go back here, let's turn a few pages to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 4. I want to show you something. Ezekiel 4, verse 1. You also, son of man, take you a tile and lay it before you, and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem. Now, Ezekiel had been taken captive in Nebuchadnezzar's second captivity. He was in Babylon, along with many Jews in the area of Babylon. And the temple was still in Jerusalem. There was still a Jewish state. There was still a king on the throne. But it wasn't going to be but just for a few years. Within just a matter of a very few years after Ezekiel wrote this, these prophecies, these things happened. So Ezekiel is in the area of Babylon. The temple is still there. And he is told to take a tile and to make like a little model city here, representing Jerusalem. In verse 2, lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it. Set the camp also against it, and set battering rams against it round about. Moreover, take you unto you an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between you and the city. Set your face against it, and it shall be besieged, and you shall lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. Now, let's notice this. Here was Ezekiel portraying a siege against Jerusalem, which did occur within a matter of a few years. And he went through this, people were gathered around, they saw him building all these little catapults and all these little battering rams, and he set him up, how long, we don't know exactly how long it took him to do this, but he must have had quite the deal, he could have, people, sort of like a little setup, little kids have where they got all their little toy soldiers and everything around. Well, Ezekiel built up this little model city, and he built up these siege fortifications and all these little things, and people were coming and looking at it and trying to figure out, God says, now, I want you to do all this, and it shall be a sign to the house of Israel. Now, when Solomon died, Judah and the nation of Israel split. The 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom. They got them a new king, Jeroboam. The southern tribes, centered in Judah and Jerusalem, retained Solomon's line, the Solomon's son. Now you've got two nations that continue in their history for about 200 years, from the death of Solomon down to about 721 BC, a little over 200 years, when the Assyrians came in and captured Samaria and northern Israel, transported the 10 tribes into captivity, brought in other people, and settled them in that area. Now, things in Judah went on. God delivered the Jews from the Assyrians. This was during the reign of King Hezekiah. God sent an angel and wiped out the Assyrian army, and so the Jews were spared from that. And life went on there for about another 120 years before Nebuchadnezzar finally came in. 120 years is a long time. We're looking back, for us, that'd be like looking back to the 1870s. That's a long time. A lot of things have happened. Israel went into captivity. 120 years go by. The Babylonians come. They take Judah into captivity. Now, Ezekiel is told to portray this siege of Jerusalem. Well, they're all the same thing. Did Ezekiel know that there was a difference? Was he just sort of using the terms synonymously? Well, let's notice right here in verse 4. He was told to lie upon his left side and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days that you shall lie upon it, you shall bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon you the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when you've accomplished them, lie again on your right side, and you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed you each day for a year. Now, clearly, Ezekiel knew the difference between Israel and Judah. And there was a distinction that was made here. The 390 days, symbolic of 390 years. If you take the date of Israel's captivity in 721 and their removal, they were settled up in the cities of the Medes. If you come down 390 years later, it brings you to 331, which was the year Alexander the Great overthrew the Median Empire. And at that point, that date marks the beginning of the great influx of Israelite migration from that area between the Black and the Caspian Sea up into northwestern Europe. They were in that period of captivity, that period of time. Well, Ezekiel marked that out symbolically, but the siege of Jerusalem, we're told, was a sign for the house of Israel. There was a duality that was there. What was going to be experienced by Judah at Jerusalem was a sign for the house of Israel in the end time. As we come on back a little further in Ezekiel chapter 8, Ezekiel has a vision. He's sitting there with some people in the area of Babylon, and in a vision, he sees an angel come down and pick him up by a lock of hair and transport him through the air for 200 or 300 miles and plop him down in Jerusalem in the inner court of the temple. The temple, of course, is still standing. Now, this is a vision. We're told here in the middle of verse 3 that he brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem. So in vision, Ezekiel is transported. He sort of sees himself, goes into almost like a trance, sees himself transported, and here he is there at the door of the gate, the gate there, or the door of the temple, the inner gate. And he was told to look and see what he saw, and he saw this image here in verse 5. In verse 6, he said unto me, Son of man, you see what they do, even the great abominations that the house of Israel commit here? That I should go far off from my sanctuary? Turn again, you'll see greater abominations. So he brought me to the door, and I looked, behold, a hole in the wall, and so he sees all this. He sees these wicked abominations. In verse 10, all the idols of the house of Israel. Well, the house of Israel is in captivity, but he sees that here symbolically. In verse 12, Son of man, you see what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark. Every man in the chambers of his imagery, they say the Lord doesn't see us. The Lord has forsaken the earth. It's amazing. Some folks don't think God sees well in the dark. Evidently they don't think He has good night vision, because somehow they're emboldened to do things when the lights are out that they wouldn't do when, bright spotlight shining down on them. Well, I'm here to tell you, God sees just as well in the dark as He does in the daylight. So it doesn't matter whether you turn the lights out or not. God sees. And so he was told to turn and he'd see even greater abominations. They brought him into the inner court, verse 16, and he saw 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east. Now that's a sunrise service. When is the sun in the east? When it rises. It's not in the east when it sets, not in the east at noon. It's in the east when it rises. So he shows up, and here folks that are there celebrating a sunrise service. That was a big deal back in Babylon. They called it Ishtar. They had a goddess by that name. That name is used right on down today. And, there are folks that think they're delivered to do all these abominations. We heard a little bit about abominations in the sermonette. Well, here God says these are abominations. And so God shows Ezekiel in a vision these things happening in Jerusalem at the temple. And in reality, it refers to what the house of Israel is doing. But Ezekiel sees it in the vision set at the temple. Coming on down in Ezekiel chapter 9, that Ezekiel sees this angelic being clothed with linen that had a writer's inkhorn by his side. This is in verse 3 of chapter 9. And the Lord told this angel, this man in the white linen robe, to go through the midst of the city and to set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that are done in the midst of Jerusalem. And then he sent another one out to slay everyone else that was not sealed or set apart in this way. And so verse 9, then he said unto me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceeding great. So, again, making the distinction between Israel and Judah, the city is full of perverseness. So we find this description, that God is going to intervene to judgment. And Ezekiel sees in this vision an angel, as it were, setting apart those who were not doing these things. Setting apart, putting a seal on those who sighed and cried for the abominations of Israel. They weren't caught up in it. They weren't a part of it. They were grieved and moved by what they saw around them. They didn't want to be part of that. That didn't represent what they believed and what they were a part of. And God took note of that. Now, there's an interesting parallel. You go back to Revelation 7, and you find there's coming a time after the first 6 seals have been opened and the heavenly signs have occurred. Stop, wait, till we've sealed the servants of our God in their forehead. And then you find the 7th seal is opened and the plagues of God are poured out. There is that parallel. That there are those who are set apart to be protected here, as it describes, as God is preparing His judgment to come forth. Now, you find a considerable amount of parallel if you go through and read that. What we find is this duality. Ezekiel sees events set in Jerusalem that represent a sign to the house of Israel. It was not the house of Israel of his day, because the house of Israel had already gone into captivity, had been into captivity for over 125 years by the time Ezekiel was writing this. They don't need a warning of what happened to them earlier. It is recorded and preserved because it applies to the end time. But Ezekiel saw events that transpired in Jerusalem in terms of captivity and destruction within a few years of his writing. But those things were a type. They were for the future. Now let's go back to Ezekiel 37. Let's make plain that Ezekiel understood the clear distinction between Israel and Judah. He didn't confuse the two, didn't think they were all the same. Let me show you first, before we get into this, let me show you here in Ezekiel 37 a verse to show how people take things out of context. I mentioned earlier, people say, you can prove anything by the Bible. Not if you take it in context. If you read Protestant writings on prophecy, one verse that many of them will quote is a portion of Ezekiel 37:21. They quote the statement from Ezekiel 37:21, "Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the nations whither they be gone, and will gather them on every side and bring them into their own land." And they quote that and they say, see, that prophesies the state of Israel. Well, there are prophecies relating to the fact that the Jews would be regathered to Jerusalem in the end time, but this isn't one of them. This doesn't prove that at all, and is totally taken out of context. Let's take it in context, and we'll see what it does show. Verse 15. "The word of the Lord came again unto me, saying, Moreover, you son of man, take you one stick, and write upon it for Judah, and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick, and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel his companions. And join them one to another in one stick, and they shall become one in your hand. And when the children of your people shall speak unto you, saying, Will you not show us what you mean by these? Say unto them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and will put them with him, even with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in my hand. And the stick whereon you write shall be in your hand before their eyes. And say unto them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the nations, whither they be gone, will gather them on every side, bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king to them all, and they shall be no more two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more at all, neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions, but I will save them out of all their dwelling places, wherein they have sinned, and will cleanse them, so they shall be my people, and I'll be their God, and David my servant shall be king over them. And they shall all have one shepherd, and they will walk in my judgments, and observe my statutes, and do them." Now, as we go through the context, it's very plain this hadn't happened yet. This certainly isn't descriptive of the state of Israel in the Middle East. They're not cleansed from all their sins. King David hadn't been resurrected over there. He wasn't. They don't have a king. Last I noticed, he's got a prime minister who's hanging on by about one vote, he's teeter-tottering on the brink. King David's not over there. We're talking of an event yet future, when all will be cleansed, when Judah and Israel will be rejoined under the resurrected King David. Now, that tells us a couple of things. One is it tells us that Israel and Judah aren't rejoined until a time in the future when God regathers them and brings them back to the land, cleanses them, and sets King David over them. That's when they're no longer going to be different nations. They're going to be brought together. That event hasn't happened. Ezekiel clearly understood the distinction between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. He knew that they were not one people. So Ezekiel writes of events using things that were happening in his lifetime, the events that the Jews were encountering, the events that were transpiring in Jerusalem and that were on the verge of transpiring in Jerusalem. Ezekiel describes those things. And he said, it's a sign for the house of Israel. There's a duality. The Judah or Jerusalem was used as representative of the house of Israel because Jerusalem was the place where David's kingdom had been set up. It was the capital under David and Solomon when the nation was one nation. And so God used events. So what happened, what the Babylonians did in Jerusalem was a type of what the Romans did in Jerusalem 600 years later. What the Romans did was a type of something that goes on beyond. Let's go back to Matthew 24. Notice here at the beginning. Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. They were impressed, big, great, impressive building. Jesus said unto them, you see all these things? I'm telling you there's not going to be left one stone standing upon another that's not going to be cast down. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, and they said, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, they understood that the Messiah was going to come in power and glory, was going to establish a kingdom. They understood that this age was going to come to an end. They didn't think they were in the kingdom now, In fact, the last question they asked Jesus before he ascended to heaven, they said, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? That was his perfect opportunity to say, you're in the kingdom now. It's already here. He didn't tell them that. They had been with him. They spent 3.5 years with him. They knew what he taught. They knew what the kingdom was. They didn't think it was some sort of fluff thing that they were in right now. They understood that. They didn't need to go and consult some expert or look up in a lexicon to see what word he used. They heard him speak it. And they spoke the same language he spoke, so they understood what he said. And he was right there. If they didn't understand what he said, they could ask him. They said, well, Lord, what would you mean by this? And they did ask him, and he told them. So now they are asking him about this event. And Jesus clearly is using the destruction of the temple, what was to occur within the lifetime of some of them, what was to occur within 40 years of speaking these words. He used the destruction of the temple and the events that would occur in Jerusalem at that time as a type of the events that would occur at the end time that would set the stage for his return. He introduced the whole subject by telling them of the destruction of the temple, and they then inquired about when was all this going to be, how would they know, and how would they know the time of the end of the age and his coming in power and glory. And he begins to go through and to detail certain things. These things had typical fulfillments in the first century, but the primary fulfillment comes on down to our day. It's interesting, Jesus talked in verse 9 about how they would be delivered and afflicted and persecuted, hated of all nations for my name's sake, he said. In verse 10, now he's speaking to his disciples who've come to him on the Mount of Olives, and he says to them, then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Now, notice, Christ warns about what was going to happen. He says many are going to be offended. There are going to be there are going to be some who are going to become so filled with resentment and animosity, they're going to begin to hate one another and betray one another when the pressure gets on. They'll be offended. They will change their conduct and actions based on other people. It's interesting. I guess in American history, the name Benedict Arnold has been synonymous with traitor. But Benedict Arnold didn't start his career as a traitor. He was initially the youngest general in American Revolutionary War history. In fact, he was one of the youngest generals in American history, period. He was at one time a hero. But you see, Benedict Arnold became offended. He increasingly developed a resentment against his commanding officer because he felt like he was coming up with all the good ideas and the commander was taking the credit. The commander was getting all the commendations, he was getting all the recognition, and Benedict Arnold became more and more filled with resentment and hostility that he was being ignored, he wasn't getting the credit that he was due, that his ideas were being taken and used by other people, and he was not being treated as he ought. Became so filled with resentment and bitterness that ultimately he turned traitor to his fellows, to the cause for which he had at one time said he was prepared to die. He turned traitor. Now, Christ warned that there are going to be some spiritual Benedict Arnolds. They will become offended. They let what other people do so get under their skin and so embitter them that they're prepared to turn in hatred on those that at one time they accounted as brothers. But they're offended. They're resentful. Do things happen that shouldn't happen? You bet they do. Have they always? Yeah. Go through the Bible. You ever find anybody in the Bible ever had anything happen to them that could have been offensive? Did Christ have anything happen to him? Well, he said many will be offended and betray one another. Many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. So many will be offended, become resentful and embittered. Many others will simply lose sight of what the truth is. Become so balled up they don't know truth from error. They're deceived. Many will be offended. Many will be deceived. In verse 12, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many will wax cold. Now, if you go from hot to cold, you've got to pass through lukewarm on the way down. Right? The whole final stage of the church is characterized as lukewarm. These folks, lukewarm folks, they've got an excuse for why they are. Because of the way other people are acting. Because iniquity shall abound. Yeah, well, I'm this way. I'm sort of turned off, but the reason I'm turned off is because of the way all these other folks are acting. My love's grown cold because iniquity is abounding. Oh, well, that's quite all right. That's, if iniquity abounds, by all means, let your love grow cold. I don't think excuses, I don't want to have to stand before Jesus Christ and run all these becauses past Him. You can read the Scriptures, you read of folks that had because. Adam, did you eat of the tree that I told you not to? Did you do that? Well, now, because of this woman over here. Eve, did you take of the tree that I told you to? Well, because of this snake over here. He deceived me. Well, you can go down through the story and you can find time after time. The point is, of course, brethren, we can't afford to let our attitude and our response to God be determined by the conduct of other folks. We're already warned that iniquity shall abound. It's going to abound. You and I can't control whether iniquity abounds. What we are responsible for is our response to God in the midst of it. We have to respond to God with love and devotion and fervor and trust. Because you see, ultimately, the just shall live by faith. And we have to keep our eyes on God and on Jesus Christ. We've got to trust our Father and our elder brother and keep our focus in that way. Christ said, many are going to be offended. Many others are going to be deceived, and many others are simply going to become so turned off because of what other folks are doing. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Those that remain constant, steadfast, faithful to God. Verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations, then shall the end come. Then he goes on and he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso reads let him understand, then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, we've already read a little bit about that abomination. We read back in the book of Daniel that the first place that is where that's referred to, it's referred to in several places in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, chapter 11, chapter 12. And we find that if we go through historically, there was an abomination that had taken place. Daniel chapter 8 initially prophesies of it as the first place that addresses it. And again, it does so in a historical context. Daniel chapter 8 opens with a vision that Daniel had. And in his vision, he saw a ram. And this ram had two horns. And the ram went charging out, and then he saw this he-goat. It had one horn. It was a strange-looking goat. It had one horn coming out between his eyes. And this he-goat comes flying across the field, and he And he comes flying across the field and smashes into the ram and stomps on him and smashes him up. Well, then the big horn is broken off, and 4 other horns pop up in its place, and out of one of them comes a little horn. And this is described here in Daniel chapter 8. We don't have to guess what all these horns and goats are, because we're told on down here in Daniel chapter 8, verse 20, the ram that you saw having 2 horns, this represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Greece. The great horn is the first king. That's Alexander the Great. And he's broken, and 4 kingdoms stood up in his place. Stand up out of his nation, but not in his power. And then, verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, this Greek empire, when transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty. And he's going to cause intrigue to prosper. And we find, as we come on down, that what he's going to do. Now, he is the one who is represented by that little horn. Now, what is described is this little horn, in verse 10, waxed great, even to the people of God, and magnified himself. By him the daily sacrifice was taken away, verse 11, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. And the host, the people, was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, cast down the truth to the ground, practiced and prospered. How long is this vision concerning the daily sacrifice? Verse 13, the transgression of desolation, how long? Verse 24, he said unto me, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings. King James says days. Many other translations render it evenings and mornings. The Jewish translation does, because that's what it literally says in the Hebrew. Some of the translators, they didn't know quite what that meant, so they just put days down. But what it's actually a reference to is there were evening and morning sacrifices. And it refers to the cessation of daily sacrifices for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, that is exactly what happened historically. I had read you earlier from Maccabees that King Antiochus sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should follow the strange laws of the land and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple. Now, this was issued by Antiochus during the feast, right at feast time in 167 BC. He issued a decree and stopped the sacrifices, and then about 2.5 months later, showed up down there, an army showed up with this great big statue of Jupiter Olympus, which they brought into the temple, set up on the altar, and now began to offer sacrifices in the temple to Jupiter Olympus. It was right at, the period went by, as Daniel prophesied, 2,300 evenings and mornings went by where there were no the sacrifices to God were not offered in the temple. At the concluding portion of that time, the Maccabees came in and put the Greeks out, took over the temple, cleansed the altar, actually built a new altar, rededicated the temple to God, and initiated sacrifices once again. This was, as is brought out here in Maccabees, that it was in the 15th day of the month Kislev, which is the 10th month, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar. They built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. And then, as we come on down, it was then in the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month Kislev, in 164, the 148th year, that they offered sacrifice according to the law on the new altar of burnt offerings, which they had made. So the temple was rededicated. The Jews at the time of Christ and on down to our day celebrate a feast of dedication that marks the rededication of the temple to God. This abomination that was referred to, they understood what that meant. They knew what had happened. Historically, there was this period of 1,150 days or 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices that were not offered, and then this was cleansed and purged. Historically, that happened. But Jesus said, see, almost 200 years after this event, Jesus said, when you see future tense the abomination Daniel spoke of, then you know that the desolation of Jerusalem is near. Well, you see, Jesus said what Daniel described in historical context is dual. Yes, it happened a long time ago, but there's an event yet future that is going to occur. And so that is the case. You see, Daniel 12 starts out talking about the time when Michael is going to deliver, and the time of the resurrection, as it describes here in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Comes on down, and it says in verse 11, from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, the abomination that makes desolate set up, there will be 1290 days. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1335 days. But go your way till the end be, for you shall rest and stand in your lot at the end of the days. Daniel was going to stand in his lot, his inheritance, his portion, at the time of the resurrection. That's when all these days, the 1290, the 1335, were all going to end. Here we find there is an abomination future, not historical in the sense of what happened in the time of the Maccabees, but there's one yet future that is going to trigger a series of end-time events that's going to occur just over 3.5 years before the return of Jesus Christ. You see, there is a duality that runs through. We could go through and we could spend an entire sermon going through about Antiochus and many of the things, the way in which he is used as a parallel, as a type of the end-time beast power. Now, I started out the sermon making reference to this news article. You know, if you go back to Daniel chapter 2, and the place, again, the way to understand is we have to go back to the beginning and trace the story down, get it in its context. You know, in Daniel 2, Daniel describes the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, this great image. Had a head of gold, shoulders of silver, thighs of brass, legs of iron, 2 legs of iron, culminated in 2 feet, 10 toes. The 2 feet were iron and clay, an iron and ceramic mixture, not something that's cohesive. And he saw this great stone cut out without hands, of supernatural origin. Comes down from heaven, smashes the image on its feet. The whole image turns to dust and blows away. The stone becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. Well, Daniel describes in Daniel 2 that the God of heaven, in the days of those final kings, those final 10 kings, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. Daniel goes through and explains Nebuchadnezzar represented that head of gold. The Babylonian Empire, succeeded by a second empire, the empire of the Medes and the Persians, a third great empire, the Greek Empire. And then the fourth great empire, the Iron Kingdom, was Rome, that swallowed up all of the remainder. Now, the Roman Empire, from the days of Emperor Constantine, came down in two legs, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, culminating in 2 feet, 10 toes. Ultimately, the reunification of the heirs of both Rome and Constantinople. You know, Constantinople was built by Emperor Constantine. Rome is noted as the city of 7 hills. You know, there's another city of 7 hills. Constantinople was built on 7 hills. It was called the Second Rome. And so we had here this parallel. And as the story goes on, though, Constantinople was overrun by the Turks. But that didn't end the legacy of the Eastern Empire. In fact, there is a city that historically referred to itself as the Third Rome, the successor of Constantinople. That city is Moscow. The rulers of Russia, see, the Grand Duke of Muscovy at the time when Constantinople was overthrown by the Turk, he married the niece and heir of the last Eastern Roman emperor. In fact, the Pope performed the wedding and bestowed upon this duke the title of Caesar. And so you had 2 men who claimed to be the heirs of Caesar. One in the West, he spelled his name Kaiser, the Holy Roman Emperors of the West, the Kaisers. In the East, in Moscow, you had those who also called themselves Tsars. That was their version of Caesar. All the way down to the 20th century of individuals who claimed to be the heirs of Caesar. Now, there have been all sorts of attempts through history to try to put things back together again, to reunite what Constantine divided. And that is an interesting story in itself. It's not going to be a good mix, and it won't last long. The 10 kings only give their power to the beast for 1 hour, we're told. Short time. But the 10 kings are represented by 10 toes. 5 toes on each foot. The legacy of Western Rome, the legacy of Eastern Rome. So, when we see some of these things in the news, and we see things that are occurring behind the world scene, we see that there are a lot of things that are shaping up, things that a lot of people don't notice and aren't paying much attention to. But brethren, we're living in the time that God's Word speaks of. We're going to see, many of us, the culmination of all of these events. There is a duality that runs through so that we might see and understand the pattern, can understand and see the way God works, and we can also see and understand the response that God desires from us. As we face the time ahead of us, let's do so with faith and confidence in our great God, who has called us and who will sustain us and will ultimately grant us the victory in Jesus Christ. Well, brethren, it's been great to be down here, and look forward to having a chance to visit after service.